So, let's speak English. It's true, and it has already been said during this day, the situation has changed since the beginning of the year 2025 in terms of ecological transition with the withdrawal of the Americans from the Paris Agreement. But it has also changed with their refusal to continue providing aid to developing countries. In France, AFD, the French Development Agency, or ADEME, the Environment and Energy Management Agency, are under attack by far-right parties. In this context, how to respond and how to establish a common strategy between developed and developing countries, that is what we will see with our experts. To discuss with me, I'm pleased to welcome Cécile Duflot, former Minister, Executive Director of Oxfam France, Hacina Py, Chief Sustainable Officer at Société Générale, Piera Tortora, Head of 4P, Jean-Baptiste Sabatié, Deputy Director Général at Proparco, and Clubb, Managing Director of Convergence. So, Hacina Py, let's look at the present situation. There are commitments such as the Paris Agreements, the Pact for the Planet and the People. Not everything is being questioned today. Because basically, we have a single planet, you know, and it must be preserved. So, if we do not make the necessary investments, it will be worse, very worse later.
I think it's clear, and I'm not going to repeat what our previous speaker said in terms of what we see already, in terms of the increase in temperature and the concrete flooding that has been much bigger over the last years, and the droughts and so on. So very clearly, I mean, if you remember what the Green Deal was, for me it was very compelling that we had this decade to act. So we don't really have time. So today there is a small music somewhere saying, yeah, well, maybe we don't have time for transition, you know what, ESG is not the fashion thing anymore. But it's not as if we had an option. I mean, we don't have a plan B. And the delay we take in the transition is already meaning, in terms of physical risks and deterioration of nature, another type of risks arising. So that's very clear. I mean, working for a bank, for us, everything is about risk. And so the risk of the transition is still here, and we need to invest. But if not, then we see the rising risk of anything that is the deterioration of nature. And to finish on this one, I thought it was very interesting, the analysis published by the World Economic Forum in December last year about the cost of inaction, the fact that we still should invest, of course, in climate mitigation, like 2% of world GDP today, 1% already in adaptation, because this is the reality. And that 3% of global GDP invested today to remain within the Paris Agreement would avoid 15-something% of loss of GDP each year by the end of the century. So that's a compelling number, I think.
Cécile Duflot, the current situation shows us that there has been a multiplication of extreme climatic events, whether in Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, which push us to reaffirm with force the green objectives and especially their profitability. Do you agree with that?
I think, and I would like to insist, because Oxfam published a recent report on that, there is some highlights that climate change in recent decades has significantly worsened water shortage in East and Southern Africa. I mean, the consequences of climate change are not the same if you are poor, if you are rich, if you live in the south, or if you live in the north. Because it's depriving over 116 million people, 40% of the population, of clean drinking water. That's the reality. So of course we need to insist and to reaffirm with force the green objectives. And the surge in extreme climate events is the proof of global inequalities. I would like to insist on that we are not all the same to face this reality. And the countries that the most scandalous, I have to say, that the countries least responsible for climate change suffer the most and that the fewest resources to cope it. So we need to act differently. And in the face of the climate crisis, wealthy nations, it's why we want to insist, including emerging economies, because of their responsibility, historically responsible for this global climate change. It's a question now of justice, because this dual responsibility is to reduce their greenhouse gas emission again and again, and help the most vulnerable population. We are in that moment that climate change is not only a physical issue, is an issue of justice.
Piera Tortora, we are witnessing a wake-up call because everyone realizes that the whole system is in danger as far as environment is concerned. But at the same time, you have to prove that ESG is something profitable. So how do you do?
Thank you so much, Isabelle, and let me thank also IFD for the invitation to be here with you today. I'm very happy. So let me start with some data, actually. So the new data from IRENA, so the International Renewable Energy Agency, that was just published, shows us that the clean energy boom last year broke all previous records. So 90% of new power additions worldwide are actually from clean energy, and also globally, renewable grew by 15%. Mainly led by solar. So this is not coming from an idealistic motivation. This is not coming from a moral imperative. This comes from a business reality. This comes from the reality of how energy markets are evolving. But I think the other important point, which is a little bit the topic of our section, is also the high-level panel on climate finance chaired by Nick Stern, Vera Songwe, and Amar Bhattacharya has showed that in order to achieve the climate transition, $6.5 trillion will be needed in all economies on average every year by 2023. So, and the largest investment increase will need to happen in developing countries, emerging economies, excluding China. So I think that the key point is, how do we enable these countries who will be responsible for over 50% of the emissions, and where investments in clean energies are right now so low, and which are also very fiscally constrained, how do we allow them to do these investments? And this question was really also at the heart of the the summit for new financing pact that was held here in Paris, held by your president, Macron, together with many world leaders back in June 2023. And the question was really, how do we allow countries to be able to invest in climate without having to jeopardize fighting poverty? And in fact, how do we build a more efficient multilateral system, financial system that allows countries to deliver on both climate and development at the same time? I think the good news is that, since the summit, there is now 71 countries that are part of the 4P, which, the Paris Pact for People and the Planet, which emerged from the summit. There's many coalitions that work on the different aspects of the reform of the international financial system in a very concrete manner. And I think I'll have a chance to tell you more about this later. But we also recognize that right now, and especially in the past few months, the geopolitics has really changed. I think this, as you said, is a little bit a wake-up call also in terms of the kind of multilateral system that we have and how it is strongly impacted the minute one big country changes their policies. But I also think that on the positive side, the business reality for the climate transition is still there. And also different countries are looking around to see how they can work differently together to continue to advance their climate priorities and ambitions. So I see a lot of European countries looking at now how to work differently together. I see a lot of countries from the South, the BRICS, the V20, but I think we really need to maintain that 4P spirit about how do we actually build a coalition that builds bridges across these countries, the North, the South, the East, the West, small countries, big countries, so that we can really deliver on climate and the people and the planet.
Jean-Baptiste, Sabatié, Piera Tortora just said a lot of things changed since the past 3 months, and that's right. And there is a lot of tensions on the side of the Trump administration that question its heads. And do you feel tensions at Proparco, which is an 85% subsidiary of AfD? What do you think? What do you feel now?
Thank you. First of all, I think our situation in France is different from of USAID is different from the one we are experiencing at Agence Française de Développement group and Proparco within this group. First of all, we have not received any message from our public authorities stating that we have to shift dramatically our mandate as it happened in the US. So that's clear, so clear. I will come back to the tension we can feel, but we have not received this kind of message. Second, within Agence Française de Développement group, in particular when it comes to Proparco, our model is definitely different from the one on which USAID has been built. Our model is much more, I would say, an investment model than an aid model. We have been doing this for decades at Proparco. Our job is to finance by debt or equity projects which has to be sustainable, both from a, I would say, SDG perspective and a financial perspective. And to do so, we have to have a balanced model, financial model at Proparco. So we have been demonstrating this for years, working in more than 100 countries currently. Then I would say that it remains that in certain cases where the context is really challenging for an institution like Proparco, we could have to join forces with public resources coming, for instance, from the French states or from the European Commission. We are relying on certain programs to do so. And this, what is interesting, is that we have to be realistic. You can feel a tension between competitiveness of, for instance, Europe or countries and their commitment to sustainable development and, I would say, international solidarity. That's a big agenda, which is a geopolitical agenda. My feeling, my belief is that you can combine these two agendas, in particular when it comes to working alongside companies, as French companies, which are a commitment to a common sustainable development and the common challenges. And in this case, we can join forces, we can keep and stick to our mandate of sustainable development and work and be put a strong effort working with European companies and French companies, for instance. So I'm not that worried. It's a challenge, but I think in France the picture is way different from what is happening in the US, and you don't have to believe on what you can see on certain press in France. It doesn't represent the majority of our citizens.
Yes, of course. So, Chris Clubb, you have a big experience of crisis. For you, there has always been ups and downs in sustainable development. But what do you think about this crisis? Do you think it's worse than the others?
Thank you very much. So I've been involved in financing projects, capital investment in emerging markets, developing countries since 1994. And I can assure you, there's lots and lots of volatility over that 31 years. I think we need to break this down into our medium and long-term objectives and the short-term challenges to achieve those objectives. If the developing countries were in this room, they'd say, sure, we're trying to achieve climate objectives through the Paris Agreement, but they also look at something called the Sustainable Development Goals. Developing countries and developed countries have agreed we need to achieve the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals in the medium and long term in these countries. Best estimate, there's around $5 to $7 trillion of investment required annually in these 142 countries to achieve that. Big picture, there's not enough capital in those countries. There's maybe 20, 25 billion trillion of capital in those countries. The benefit we all have in this room is, and one thing that has unfolded over that 31-year period, there's been a huge growth in global financial assets, including organizations like Société Générale. Global financial assets are equal to around 4.5% of global 4.5 times global GDP. It's just asymmetrically distributed. It's pretty much 95% in developed countries in China and only 4 or 5% in these other developing countries. The second big trend that has unfolded is investors have actually embraced, in general, impact investment. The Global Impact Investment Network estimates that impact investment is growing at around 27% a year. So there's lots of money in the global financial system. There's a huge growth in appetite of impact investment. Our problem is it's asymmetrically distributed. It's in rich, high-income countries. The challenge that we have in the medium and long term, how do we get public sector development finance and what's known as official development assistance to change? It really has not changed in the last 25, 30 years. We're here, and many advocate what we call private investment mobilization. How do we get some of that $478 trillion moving into developing countries where that money is investing in the SDGs and Paris Agreement? It will not happen voluntarily. As our colleague from Société Générale said, it's all about risk. It's too risky in these markets for most investors to invest. It doesn't meet their fiduciary and regulatory mandate, full stop. Therefore, how does the public sector alter the risk and risk return so Société Générale and others can invest in these markets because it meets their fiduciary and regulatory obligations? It's not complicated. For the last decade, there's been around 2,000 what we call blended finance or mobilization transactions. All of it fragmented, all of it customized, but we've learned from that what needs to happen differently. And we're going to be distributing later this week a consultations report called On the Scale Private Investment Mobilization Project in time for the Financing for Development Forum conference in Sevilla. And it really describes, it's currently not working. How do we mobilize using public sector funding much more effectively and efficiently in the medium and long term to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement? I want to just quote some statistics just about the US aid, because it seems to be dominating here. We all allocate our aid in what we call official development assistance. The US, back in the 1960s, had peaked at 0.65% of their GDP was in the form of official development assistance. That hit a trough of 0.1% back in the 1990s, and it's back to 0.23%. So the US has historically withdrawn or reduced substantially, and yet development and development finance continues throughout all this. So please, let's not lose sight on our medium and long-term objectives, because there's always going to be short-term noise. There's always going to be debt crises. There's going to be emerging markets crises. That will always happen. But how do we focus on the medium and long term to improve the lives and climate outcomes of people living in these countries?
Thank you, thank you. Cécile Duflot, Oxfam has made recommendation for more funding in developing countries to reach $27 trillion. How do we reach this aim? What is your solution? Taxes, new financial tools? What do you suggest?
I think we need maybe to change our mind in the necessity of funding more, especially with the consequences of the war in Ukraine, the inflation, and of course the climate change. So this amount, 27 trillions, is for us a necessity. So how can we try to move on? First, I have to say that the involvement and maybe the effectiveness of private sector involvement in development remains at this time unproven. We need to say that public-private approaches are often, or maybe always, designed to ensure that the community assumes the risk taken by private players. So it means it's globally an issue for all of us, a community issue. So it's not, there is not the main issue in, the main solution in private investment. And the recent reforms have been mostly technical, aiming to operate with constant resources rather than increasing them. And that's for us the main problem. In a context where international aid, and you know what happened with the US, is collapsing, the situation becomes more and more tense. So we need to say that to ensure the Global South is more involved in the international reform agenda, that's an important point. We know that our financial institutions were designed during a time where colonial rules are at the table, and we didn't have changed it anymore. So we need to move, and we need to think that taxing wealth is a part of the solution. We are, of course, involved in the Brazilian decision to try to put this issue on the table, and we should move on again and again. Because we can say away that private sector is the solution, that there is a lot of involvement, but not traduction in reality, and the lack of investment and the lack of money and solidarity with poor countries and poor people is more and more important.
You have released a tax manifest to find solutions with new solutions. Can you tell us about this tax manifest?
We published this tax manifesto for France to show that there is possibly different way to collect money, and especially with a tax organization designed to fight inequalities, which is not the reality. The increase of the billionaires and the multi-billionaires is a risk for the solidarity, is a risk for the health of our society, and we can see what happened in other countries, and especially in the US. It is a risk for democracy too. So this tax manifesto is not only a solution to fight inequalities, but is also a solution to try to prevent the crisis of our northern democracy. We are deeply convinced of that.
Piera Tortora, what do you think? What are the solutions you could have? Because it's necessary to identify sectors that pollute and low taxed, perhaps in order to tax them. You also suggest to mobilizing private capital and launching new issue with the central banks. These are your solutions?
Thank you so much. Well, I think we really need to work on a broad array of solutions. Definitely there is the area of private capital mobilization that also Chris worked a lot on and that he's been discussing. We need also to find better solutions to the increasing debt challenges of developing countries to create fiscal space, and there is a number of new tools that we can use. When it comes to innovative sources of financing, well, perhaps if you have been to the discussion that happened just before on biodiversity credits, you have heard Sylvie Goulard, who's actually leading one of the 4P coalitions on biodiversity credits, and that's definitely a key area of work. But I would like to touch perhaps upon two, because we mentioned taxes. So definitely there is an emerging consensus that a key area for reform to generate new and additional financing for the transition and for development is from new forms of taxation known as solidarity levies. So is around the taxation of polluting and yet under-taxed sectors that at the same time have hugely benefited from globalization. I'm talking about fossil fuels, maritime shipping, international aviation, and financial services, among others. And there is this 4P coalition, which is the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force, which is led by Laurence Toubiana, who's been doing a lot of work, and they've actually demonstrated demonstrated, they have shown that the revenues from each one of these levies could mobilize about $100 billion per year. So there is huge potential to scale up global solidarity levies. There is right now a negotiation happening at the IMO on the International Maritime Transport levies. So we see this as a very promising area. I also like to talk about debt and private finance mobilization, but perhaps we can come back to that later. So.
Yes, of course. Hacina Py, can we set up new profitable financial tools with a sharing of risks between public and private actors? Perhaps it could be a solution?
Yeah, sure. And to come back to what my co-panelists said before, we are a private bank. We have several dozens of billions of euro of exposure on the emerging world, right? On infrastructures for sanitation, for access to education, access to potable water. We do that because we work a lot with export credit agencies all over the world, and a lot, of course, with multilateral development banks and local bilateral relations. So there is a lot. We do it. We could do more. We could have some issues with the banking regulation, Basel IV. So I don't have time to enter into the details, but that means for us that when we work side by side with multilateral, maybe it won't work anymore. We'll have to get more cover on the risks. But globally, what we're doing today allows us already quite a lot to work on the development market.
Jean-Baptiste, Sabatié, for you, it's necessary to take into account the sharing of risk. There are important regulatory issues to make as many financial resources as possible available for emerging countries to move towards sustainable development. What do you think about that?
Thank you. Maybe building, for instance, on what Chris Clubb was saying and Hacina Py was saying. So, first of all, we definitely think that the key is in private sector mobilization. I would say that our view at Proparco is that we have to be even more focused on local finance, local capital, private capital mobilization. Even if the big amounts maybe are not there, we can find decent, I would say, amount in this country. And why we consider that it's good to focus on this, because it's about risk perception. And if you want to convince, I would say, for instance, a Nigerian private bank to mobilize more private capital for a Nigerian project, their perception of the Nigerian risk would be way beyond what will be the perception from I would say a worst a French or a German or Canadian investor. So that's one of our beliefs. We think that we have to work on the risk perception. We, as a development financial institution, Proparco, active in more than 100 countries for decades, as I was saying, we think that we have something to share about what is our track record, where is it risky, where is not risky, how do you do decent deal, paying you a good return from an SDG perspective and a financial perspective. We have this to share. But we have to share this with the ones which are most likely to listen to and to be convinced. That's once. Then I will come back to the regulatory framework. I think changing regulation will cost less to France than putting public money into sustainable development. We have to build more on convincing that we have to adapt the regulation. I would take a few examples, for instance. With the track record we have as a development financial institution, I think we can demonstrate alongside other institutions similar to Proparco that the risk perception is maybe not accurate. And when an institution like Proparco and the others is involved in a deal, in a transaction, maybe you could have the other investor not be so penalized by investing alongside the development financial institution. So I think that there is a plea to do on this front. Then we, as development financial institution, we are suffering some constraint to which, for instance, are not relevant in our perception. For instance, for local French regulation, we are preventing from investing to a significant amount in the equity of local private banks. And it's a pity, because reinforcing the equity of private banks, local private banks, really it's a very good way of mobilizing capital, of financing the true economy there. And for local, I would say national regulations, we are prevented from doing this. The other thing on which, the other front, regulatory front on which we think we could work also is to have a stronger recognition of the value of a guarantee provided by Proparco to a worsened company or to a local company or local banks. It's not taken into consideration as it could be, I think, and that's a good way also in helping mobilizing more capital. And what we have seen, and even recently with CRD4, is that the regulation is going on the opposite way, putting more and more capital in front of investment in emerging markets when it comes to equity, when it comes to project finance. And really, if we go this way, it will be really, really difficult to build solidarity between developing world and the developed countries.
Clubb, another solution for you is to better distribute the money to developed countries and better collaboration between private and public sectors?
Yes, but not absolutely. There's lots of needs in developing countries that, quite frankly, can only be met by grants. We're not here to discuss that. I'm not here to discuss that. What I'm here to discuss is there's around $6 trillion of investment, capital investment required in these developing countries if we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement in those countries. We all know that. There's not enough money in those countries to achieve that. We talk about the difference between perceived risk and actual risk. Whether we like it or not, 88% of that $472 trillion is invested by the private sector, primarily due to risk and risk return. It's already invested. If we want that money to be flowing into these markets, we have to create an investment profile that meets where they're currently invested. Otherwise, they will remain invested in developed markets. They have no obligation to invest in developing countries. They have an obligation to meet their fiduciary and regulatory obligations. Now, the reality is there is a difference between perceived risk and actual risk. And we in the public sector know that, but we're not putting our money at risk in a way that will basically bridge the gap between perceived risk and actual risk and demonstrate to investors over the medium term that this gap actually exists. We would contend, and there's lots of history over the last decade, how do we use some French government money through AFD, through the ministry, through Proparco, that smartly bridges that gap between perceived risk and actual risk? We've identified 12 models that can be easily simplified and standardized where public sector money is not given away, because we need to give the money that's given away for traditional development purposes, but this money is allocated to absorb that risk between actual and perceived risk. And if the risk unfolds closer to our perceptions in the development community, that public sector money will not be lost, but we will be mobilizing the private investment to take on that capital investment. There's no way we can increase official development assistance to fill that gap. I'll give you an example. All 32 rich countries allocate around $225 billion of official development assistance every year. The investment needs in these markets are $6 trillion. We all know there's only one way to achieve the SDGs and Paris Agreement, to mobilize private investors to invest in these markets. If we don't, it's very simple. We will not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement, and we can't ask investors to take on an investment risk and a risk return that does not meet their fiduciary and regulatory obligations. That's insanity. Therefore, how do we allocate public sector money with all the wisdom we have to bridge that gap and mobilize them? And for capital investment in these markets, we have to mobilize private investment. To do what Oxfam wants to do, humanitarian assistance and so on, there's no room for investment there. That's traditional grant activity.
Piera Tortora, I don't know who wants to react, because there is, among the solutions, there is also blended finance. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think this is what Chris was alluding to. Thank you so much. And I think there is also, various aspects into how we scale that up. One has to do with what we say, moving from haute couture to prêt-à-porter. So actually, how do we move towards more standardized products of blended finance that can really help build confidence, transparency in the market and replicate good examples? But there is also a prudential regulation aspect, and it was touched upon Jean-Baptiste and also Chris. We see that in a way there is a little bit of a schizophrenia in the system. We're trying to push MDBs to mobilize more private finance, more private capital by employing more guarantees and other de-risking instruments. But when they do, actually the de-risking effect of these instruments is not really captured by the credit rating agencies and is not captured by the regulators. So there is a big agenda that the 4P is working on how to make sure that actually these new instruments are better captured by prudential regulations, and there is also a bigger conversation there. But I think it's really important to highlight this is not a deregulation agenda. This is very much an agenda about how do we make regulation more risk sensitive. And also, of course, this is not the only impediment to the barriers of investments in developing countries, but it's an important one. And I think there is growing momentum around this agenda. It was really encouraging that even the governor of the Central Bank of France, when he was in Cape Town for the Financing Common Summit, he said he recognized, this is an issue that we need to look into.
Hacina Py, you also need civil servants who know how to finance projects in the countries concerned. At Société Générale, you had to work with Meridiam to train these civil servants. How did you do that?
Yeah, I'll explain that. And coming back to what you just said, I mean, it's true, we need catalytic capital. So if you want the math to work, if you remember 2015, we had the SDGs, we had, of course, COP21 in this country, and on top of that, you had the famous from billions to trillions. And for that, of course, the capital market is here, private market is here, but we need some first loss, we need catalytic capital, and IFD, who hosts us today, has a very interesting workshop to which we contribute to help the private sector understand and map what is available, because it's like a jungle for us to understand where the helps are. So that's one point. Then, yeah, it's about, to your question, it's about capacity building. My first experience 10 years ago as head of export finance of my bank was to go to East Africa, meet a client which could not repay us. It was a big loan in renewable energy. And why could they not repay us? Because there was a lot of energy, but there was nobody to purchase it. There was not enough industrial setup in the country. So you need this plan, you need the capacity building, and you need, in the example you took, civil servants as well to understand how to put in place public work concessions, for example, and start deploying projects in the countries. So that's why we were invited by Meridiam in this example, with many other institutions that are here today, to set up a plan for the training of civil servants on project finance, using the World Bank IFC models already, not reinventing anything, but putting on the table what is needed for civil servants to take on the industrialization and how to finance it.
And so you have an example of successful achievements, for instance, in Africa or in the new industrial sector?
Yeah, we have a lot, of course. What I wanted to bundle it with the previous roundtable on climate, you know that when we started to work on the decarbonation path of our own portfolio, the case of Africa was discussed, of course. So first, what do you do with coal? What do you do with upstream gas in some countries? So in our case, we decided not to go with it, but there was a big discussion about, the development. But more than that, when we touched hard-to-abate sectors like steel or cement, we realized that in African countries, our clients were already closer to the target because they use circular economy, because they go for secondary steel, because they have a way to produce cement that is already much less carbonized than we do in OECD countries. So yeah, there are a lot of successful examples, of course, in renewable energy financing, in infrastructure for social and SDGs, as I mentioned before, but more than that, already financing industrial setups that are lower carbon. And the good thing is now with CBAM and other organizations, you will see that these countries could be, if they develop their industry better, they could be even more competitive than we could imagine, thanks to the lower carbon state with circular economy.
We're going to take some questions. Thank you for your questions. Alors, il y a une question en français, donc je vais la lire en français. Hein. Excusez-moi, je ne vais pas traduire tout de suite. Une des décisions majeures prises à Bakou était de formaliser la mobilisation de 300 milliards de dollars par an pour financer l'adaptation climatique dans les pays en voie de développement, en prenant compte la sortie des USA dans de nombreuses coalitions mondiales, luttant contre le réchauffement climatique et l'affaiblissement apparent du multilatéralisme global. Est-ce que cet objectif est toujours réalisable ? Je ne sais pas si vous voulez que je vous relise la question. Est-ce que quelqu'un veut répondre? Who want to answer?
Maybe I can try. I think there is an issue about all this involvement in different international moments, and especially on climate, and especially found for the South countries, because there is the involvement and there is reality. And for a long time, Oxfam produced reports to show that involvement were not reduced in reality. So of course, the situation in the US is a problem for all of us, but at this moment, the involvement of all our countries, even France, are not at the level we promised, not only in Baku, but from Copenhagen to today, there is a lack of finance, and especially I heard you about the difference between loan and grant, but I think in that issues of adaptation, the enormous needs are for grants, of course, because it's why I said it's a question of justice. It's not only a question of solidarity. And a lot of countries of Global South, especially in Bridgerton Initiative, show us that we need to understand that now the issue of the question of adaptation is a question of justice, not only a question of solidarity.
Yes, you want to answer?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. Fully agree to that idea that, grants are incredibly important. The plight of many people in many developing countries requires grants. What we advocate is that there is around $480 billion of money sitting on the balance sheets of multilateral development banks. There's around 40 billion sitting on Proparco and the other bilateral development finance institutions. That $520 billion of capital can kind of arrange or underwrite around $330 billion of new financing transactions every year. We need to get that money flowing into projects that are co-financed by the private sector, because that money goes into investment, not grant money, capital investment in these markets. We estimate that around 10% of the grant money, official development assistance, can take on the risk that the multilateral development banks and DFIs cannot take on. So when you combine the power of that $520 billion of capital on the balance sheets of MDBs and DFIs, and only around 10% of official development assistance, so the other 90% can do exactly what you would like it to do. You then create the capacity to mobilize around $500 billion of private investment every year. Not more than $500 billion. You'd need a lot more money than that's in the system. That compares to around $25 billion today. So we can multiply private investment and mobilization by around 20 times by just using around 10% of the grant money, but the balance sheet capital of the MDBs and DFIs much more strategically, and that's what our consultations report we're releasing next week really identifies how.
Thank you. We are going to take another question. Can you explain why many investors prefer to exclude some sectors instead of transition, like livestock and palm oil? These are sectors the world needs and requests, and we can have a great impact today, rather than hopes for tomorrow. Who wants to answer?
Everybody's looking at me, so. No, it's a good question. You know, sometimes, I mean, if we are talking about the energy transition, for example, there are clear exclusions from some institutions on upstream, for example, exploration and production. That's it, because it's not going to transition. For agriculture, well, palm oil is a case, effectively. It depends on the actors, but some actors, maybe a bit far away from the geographies in question, will start with some exclusions of some actors where they believe they cannot really help them transition. So the problem is, at some point you need to draw a line. So it depends on the institutions, of course, but sometimes you draw a line and you just keep part of the clients where you think you know, you can progress with them.
Thank you. Another questions about blended finance. The volumes were 15 billion US dollar in 1993, only a 5-year high. How do you explain this plateau? Is blended finance a real solution, or is there much to do about nothing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think we should all remember, blended finance predates 2015. We mixed together public sector concessional money and public sector non-concessional money, i.e. the French government giving some money to Proparco or the European Commission giving money to European Investment Bank to do some very good development impact stuff. But it has never really been about private investment mobilization. Today, and on average in the last 10 years, 70% of concessional public sector money from the French government, the German government, the Canadian government, is given to the multilateral development banks and DFIs to do great work, to achieve development impact and climate impact, but has no or low private investment mobilization behind it. We should throw out the history of blended finance and think forward, moving forward. Blended finance should be a tool from the development community to mobilize private investment at scale. That has never been the objective of blended finance or mobilization. There's no strategy, I can assure you. There's no action plan. Most countries don't have an action plan or strategy. The development community doesn't have an action plan or strategy. We're advocating that needs to change with the Financing for Development 4 outcome document that's going to be produced in Sevilla. That should be tantamount to an action plan to use public sector money in this third leg of blended finance to mobilize private investment. And the only way to do that is to create investments that meet the fiduciary and regulatory obligations of Société Générale and other, and therefore make the concessional money available to the best ideas that will mobilize with the highest impact, whether it comes from the private sector, the public sector, the philanthropic sector. We should be indifferent. We're here to mobilize at scale to achieve scale impact, and whoever has the best idea should get that magic money of concessional funding. And then 10 years from now, we won't be here saying it's only mobilizing 25 billion a year, because up until now, blended finance and mobilization essentially has been a little bit of a random walk, because there's no strategy or action plan, even at individual countries, let alone in the development community.
Jean-Baptiste, you want to add something, but very shortly, because
very
it's
shortly.
the end of our roundtable.
Exactly. I think to have a strategy, you need a goal. We have a goal when it comes to private mobilization this year at Proparco. We have been asked to demonstrate by the end of this year that for €1 of financing we are providing, we have mobilized €1 of private money. So that's the goal. Then blended finance is one of the big tools to do so, but we have to be innovative, and we have ideas at Proparco to reach this goal. I mean, so the goal is there, and the strategy will come.
Yes, Piera Tortora, very shortly.
Very shortly, I just wanted to say that I think this year also collectively we have a great opportunity to work together to advance this agenda. Chris has mentioned the FFD4, there is also the COP30, and there a key element is not only the 300 billion target that we have mentioned before, but also the Baku to Belém roadmap, which is how do we actually achieve the 1.3 trillion that is needed in developing countries for the transition. And that can really provide us a roadmap in terms of having objectives, having a clear idea of what reforms will be undertaken where, so that we can collectively move. And I think because here is full of investors in the private sector, I just wanted to invite everybody to get very engaged, because it will not be successful without the engagement of the private sector.
Thank you, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you very much.